How does a playful, bright-eyed 3-year-old girl end up the victim of a brutal crime, inside what should have been the safety of her own home? Natalie Leah Miller was just 3 years old when her life was cut short in a way no child should ever experience. Born in California's Central Valley, she was the kind of child who left smiles in her wake, curious, energetic, and full of warmth. She loved to play, to explore, and to make people laugh. But behind that innocence was a home life teetering on instability, where love and danger lived side by side. In March of 2009, Natalie's world came to a violent end. Emergency responders were called to the home she shared with her mother and her mother's boyfriend, only to find the toddler unresponsive, her body marked by injuries that told a story no child should ever have to endure. The explanation offered was simple, too simple. But the truth, as investigators would soon learn, was anything but. At first, it looked like a tragic accident. A fall, perhaps. Maybe a medical emergency. But the autopsy revealed a different story, one written in bruises, fractures, and blunt force trauma. A story that pointed to something far more sinister. And as authorities began to unravel what really happened behind closed doors, they found themselves facing a disturbing truth. The people entrusted with Natalie's safety may have been the very ones who failed her the most. This isn't just a story about a crime. It's a story about overlooked warnings, blurred responsibility, and a community forced to ask how this could have happened, and why no one stopped it in time. What really happened to Natalie Miller? And who, ultimately, was responsible? That's exactly what we are here to unravel today. Welcome to That Police Officer. If you're new to the channel, here's what we do. We investigate, seek justice, and uncover the truth behind gripping true crime stories. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the bell, and join us in the pursuit of justice. Natalie Miller was more than just a name on a case file. She was a daughter, a granddaughter, a niece. A tiny spark of life who lit up the room wherever she went. Born in the quiet city of Visalia, California, she lived in a neighborhood that felt safe. One where families kept to themselves, and trouble wasn't something people expected just a few houses down. On the outside, everything appeared normal. But normal can be a disguise. And behind that peaceful setting, something deeply troubling was unfolding. At the center of her home life was her mother, Nicole Lee, a woman navigating the challenges of young motherhood, personal struggles, and complicated relationships. Nicole's relationship with Ryan Jones would prove to be the most fateful decision of all. He wasn't Natalie's father, but he quickly became a constant presence in their lives. To some, he was quiet and unassuming. To others, there was something harder to define, a discomfort, a sense that something wasn't quite right. As the months passed, cracks began to form in the image of a stable home. The signs were subtle but present. Missed medical appointments, unexplained bruises, behavioral shifts. Some relatives noticed the changes, but were met with vague explanations or shut out altogether. There were rumors of tension, whispers of CPS involvement, but nothing that ever sparked immediate alarm. And in cases like this, where danger creeps in slowly, the silence can be just as harmful as the violence that follows. It was an ordinary morning in March 2009 in the Central Valley city of Visalia. Nothing in the stillness of the neighborhood hinted that something unimaginable was unfolding behind the walls of a small home. The call to 911 came suddenly, urgent, panicked. A child was unresponsive, barely breathing. Paramedics rushed to the scene, unaware they were about to encounter one of the most disturbing cases they'd ever face. 3-year-old Natalie Miller was found unconscious, her small body limp, her breathing shallow. The man present with her, Ryan Jones, told first responders that she had fallen, that she had hurt herself while playing. It was a story simple enough to believe in the chaos of the moment. But as emergency personnel assessed her condition, doubt began to settle in. The injuries they observed didn't align with a minor fall or a child's misstep. Natalie was quickly transported to the hospital. Despite frantic efforts to save her, she was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. What followed was a wave of confusion and disbelief. How could a child, seemingly healthy just hours earlier, suffer such devastating injuries? Doctors noted severe internal trauma, deep bruising, ruptured organs, and signs of impact too forceful to be caused by an accidental fall. It wasn't just one injury. It was many, and it told a story that no one wanted to believe. As medical examiners began their analysis, the truth became harder to ignore. Natalie's body bore evidence of blunt force trauma, extensive internal bleeding, damaged tissue, and marks indicating repeated force. These weren't the result of a single moment. They pointed to something prolonged, something deliberate. The official account was unraveling fast, and investigators knew they were dealing with something far more serious. Ryan Jones, the only adult with Natalie that day, maintained that her injuries were the result of an accident. He said she'd fallen, that she'd gotten hurt, and he hadn't realized how badly. But the autopsy results cast immediate doubt on his version of events. The pathologist concluded that the trauma inflicted was non-accidental in nature, a term that carries heavy weight in cases involving children. This wasn't a fall. This was abuse. Authorities now faced a delicate situation. Emotions were running high. Family members were in shock, mourning the loss of a child who'd just barely begun her life. But beneath the grief, suspicion was taking root. The story didn't fit. The injuries didn't lie, and the man at the center of it all wasn't making sense. In those early hours, there were more questions than answers. Why had no one seen this coming? What really happened in the moments leading up to the emergency call? And most disturbingly, how long had it been going on? Detectives began retracing Natalie's final day. Interviews were conducted. The home was examined. Ryan's behavior was scrutinized. Nicole Lee, Natalie's mother, arrived on the scene not long after and was quickly drawn into the investigation. She, too, had questions to answer. Why had she left her daughter in Jones's care? Had there been any warning signs? And if so, why weren't they acted on? Investigators were now forced to dig deeper, to go beyond the stories being told and uncover the pattern hidden in plain sight. What they would find in the coming days would not only confirm their worst fears, but expose a chain of failures that allowed a dangerous situation to spiral into the unthinkable. From the moment Natalie Miller's death was ruled suspicious, detectives found themselves stepping into a web of contradictions. What began as a child fatality case had now become a homicide investigation, and the pressure to uncover the truth mounted quickly. But clarity would not come easily. The early days of the investigation were clouded with conflicting accounts, incomplete records, and people unwilling or unable to tell the whole story. Ryan Jones was questioned immediately. His version of events was vague, shifting slightly with each retelling. Investigators noted inconsistencies in his timeline, hesitations in his answers, and an unusual lack of urgency in how he described the situation. He claimed he had done nothing wrong, that whatever had happened to Natalie must have been accidental. But the evidence was already working against him. Nicole Lee complicated the investigation even further. When questioned, she appeared shaken, overwhelmed, but also strangely defensive. Rather than placing blame or demanding answers, she seemed determined to shield Ryan from scrutiny. She told investigators he was a good man, that he loved Natalie, that he could never have harmed her. But as officers dug deeper, that loyalty began to raise serious concerns. It wasn't just Nicole's words that raised red flags, it was her omissions. She failed to mention prior incidents that pointed to instability in the home. There were missed doctor's appointments, unexplained injuries from weeks prior, and reports that had never been followed up. Child Protective Services had been contacted at least once, but for reasons that remained unclear, the case had never been escalated. Now, detectives were left wondering, Had a system built to protect children overlooked a child in crisis? The investigation turned methodical. Detectives pulled medical records and analyzed every emergency room visit. They reviewed old CPS logs, reached out to neighbors, and interviewed family members who had seen signs of trouble but never fully understood the danger. In nearly every conversation, the same theme kept surfacing. Something about the household felt off, but no one could say exactly what. It had always been just beneath the surface, subtle, silent, but there. As police continued their work, rumors began to swirl through the community. Some believed Ryan had a history of violence that had gone unreported. Others whispered about neglect, about tension between Nicole and her family, about warnings ignored. Still, others suggested that maybe Natalie's death was the result of something even more complicated, perhaps not just a crime of violence, but a failure of everyone around her to act when it mattered most. At this point, law enforcement wasn't ready to make any arrests. They didn't yet have the full picture. But one thing was certain: the story being told by the adults in Natalie's life didn't line up with the evidence. And with every day that passed, the truth felt closer, but just out of reach. The case took a decisive turn when the full autopsy report landed on the investigators' desks. Up to this point, the investigation had been marked by questions, confusion clouded by inconsistent statements, and vague denials. But now, science was stepping in to cut through the noise. And what it revealed left no room for doubt. The findings were damning. Medical examiners concluded that the injuries Natalie sustained were not compatible with any accidental cause. They weren't the result of a simple fall or a bump against furniture. They were inflicted with significant force that could only come from another person. There were signs of repeated blunt trauma, internal bleeding, and damage consistent with abuse over time. These were not fresh wounds alone. Some had begun to heal, revealing a history of prior harm. Child protection officials were re-interviewed. Their records showed that Natalie's case had brushed the system before. Concerns had been raised, but none had led to intervention. Now, those earlier moments, those small, almost forgotten warnings, took on new weight. One worker recalled a report of bruising that was never medically explained. Another remembered attempts to follow up that fell through when appointments were missed or calls went unreturned. The forensic evidence pointed in one direction, and it stood in stark contrast to the version of events offered by Ryan Jones. His statements, already inconsistent, now collapsed under the weight of physical proof. Investigators began to retrace his steps more aggressively, and a clearer narrative began to emerge. One marked not by an unfortunate accident, but by intentional, sustained violence. The shift in tone was immediate and devastating. What had once been viewed with cautious uncertainty was now seen for what it was: a brutal assault on a defenseless child. And the man who claimed to have cared for her was now at the center of a mounting case, one that was turning from suspicion to certainty. As investigators pushed deeper, the full truth began to take shape, not just through the physical evidence, but through the stories people began to tell once fear started to fade. Interviews with former acquaintances, digital records, and behavioral patterns formed a grim portrait of Ryan Jones. What emerged was not a sudden outburst or a one-time lapse in judgment, but a pattern, consistent, violent, and ultimately fatal. Former partners described Jones as volatile and controlling, prone to sudden rage, especially when confronted or when things didn't go his way. He had no criminal history of physical abuse on paper, but his past relationships suggested emotional manipulation, intimidation, and moments of unexplained aggression. He was the kind of person who operated in the shadows, out of view, behind closed doors, in the safety of silence. And with Natalie, that silence became deadly. Digital forensics added even more weight to the case. Search history from Jones's devices revealed disturbing patterns, terms related to child discipline, physical punishment, and medical symptoms that aligned with internal trauma. Though not direct confessions, these digital breadcrumbs painted a picture of someone who had both the opportunity and the mindset to harm a vulnerable child. As the facts solidified around Jones, attention turned to Nicole Lee, not as the perpetrator, but as the adult who had allowed the danger to grow. She hadn't struck the fatal blow, but her choices, her denial, her refusal to acknowledge the signs, had created the environment where violence could thrive. She had trusted a man who never earned that trust. And worse, she had protected him, even as her daughter suffered. The betrayal ran deep. Natalie needed more than love. She needed action, intervention, safety. Nicole's failure to remove her child from harm, whether out of fear, dependence, or willful ignorance, made her complicit in the tragedy that followed. That complicity wasn't criminal in the same way as Jones's violence, but morally and emotionally, it carried its own devastating weight. The heartbreak in this case wasn't just in what happened, but in how easily it could have been prevented. Two adults had the power to protect a child. One chose violence, the other chose silence. And together, they sealed the fate of a little girl who never had a chance to grow up. As the case moved toward prosecution, the focus shifted from uncovering the truth to demanding justice for Natalie and for every child whose cries go unheard until it's too late. The courtroom became the stage for a long-awaited confrontation with justice. As the trial of Ryan Jones began, the weight of the evidence was undeniable. He was charged with second-degree murder and assault on a child causing death. The prosecution presented a compelling case, laying out the grisly details of Natalie's injuries, the inconsistencies in Jones's statements, and the pattern of abuse that had been uncovered. Medical experts testified about the severity of the trauma, pointing to the deliberate and sustained nature of the violence. Forensic analysis and digital evidence further solidified the case against him. But it wasn't just the cold facts that filled the courtroom. It was the emotional toll. Natalie's family members, particularly her grandparents, were in attendance every day, their grief palpable. They had witnessed the little girl's life snuffed out in the most violent of ways, and now they were fighting for her memory. The emotional testimonies from family members added a layer of heartache to the proceedings. They described Natalie's infectious smile, her love of life, and the deep pain they felt at losing her so senselessly. The impact on the jury was profound. Many struggled to hold back tears as they listened to the harrowing details of the case. In the end, Ryan Jones was convicted and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. The conviction, while bringing some measure of justice, did little to alleviate the pain. The sentence was a bitter reminder of the life that had been stolen, a young child's future never to be realized. Nicole Lee's trial was a different matter. She was charged with felony child endangerment for her role in allowing the environment that enabled the abuse. Her failure to act, to protect her daughter, cost her 8 years in prison. It was a stark contrast to the punishment Jones received. While she had not physically harmed Natalie, her inaction had played a crucial role in allowing the abuse to continue unchecked. The community was divided in their response. Some felt the sentence was too lenient. Others felt it was a necessary step in holding her accountable. Outside the courtroom, the public reaction was swift and intense. The media coverage was dominated by the shocking nature of the case, with headlines about the brutal crime and the system's failure to intervene sooner. But amidst the tragedy, something else began to grow: advocacy. Natalie's extended family became vocal in their quest for justice, using their grief to fuel efforts to raise awareness about child abuse and neglect. Her grandparents, in particular, became tireless advocates, speaking out about the need for better protection for children and for reforms in the child welfare system. Community members rallied behind them, creating a wave of support that grew far beyond Visalia. Every day, countless children are suffering in environments that should offer them love and safety, yet are instead marked by violence, neglect, and fear. As a society, we must stay vigilant. If you suspect a child is in danger, don't turn a blind eye. Report it. Advocate for better systems of child protection. Support organizations working to prevent abuse and offer resources to at-risk families.